Mrs. Rabbit spoke.
"While I'm gone shopping at Nutkin's Market, I want all of you to go to the blueberry patch and pick blueberries for tonight's blueberry pie."
The little rabbits' faces looked delighted with the idea of having Mom's blueberry pie for tonight's dinner. It was around 1 o'clock in the afternoon when Miss Rabbit put on her bonnet and gave her children the empty basket for the blueberries. Once everyone was outside of the burrow, she closed and locked her new door. Mrs. Rabbit once again spoke to her children.
"I will be back in less than an hour. You should have plenty of time for you to go to the blueberry patch to pick the berries. I need you to stay together. Do not go off the trail. And remember that Rat McCade is here in the meadow. He never comes out in the open daylight, so you do not have to worry about him or his clan. So go straight there and straight back. I'm trusting that you will do what I have asked."
She then looked straight at Lil Pete.
"Lil Pete, please do not go wandering off."
Lil Pete didn't say anything, but just nodded in agreement. Mrs. Rabbit watched as her little rabbits hopped off in the direction of the blueberry patch. When she could no longer see her children, she turned and hopped in the opposite direction. She would stop by Mrs. Blue's treehouse and ask her if she would keep an eye on her children. Lil Pete and his brothers and sisters hopped quickly along the path. A pleasant aroma filled the air as the little rabbits ran.
"Where is that wonderful smell coming from?"
asked Cottontail as he suddenly stopped to look around.
"It's coming from over there,"
said Lil Pete. A tall, high wooden fence could be seen through the high, rough grass and a little bit off the path. Without hesitation, Lil Pete and his siblings headed towards the fence. Finding an open hole in the fence, the rabbit family took turns looking inside the hole. On the other side of the fence, the 4 rabbits saw a magnificent garden.
"Wow, look at all that food,"
said Cottontail, who was one of the last to look. Knocking Cottontail aside, Flopsy, the oldest of the rabbits, took a second to peek through the hole.
"Yeah, did you see that spinach growing over there?"
Lil Pete did not bother to take a second peek through the hole. Instead, he found a small hole underneath the fence. Lil Pete decided to climb under the fence and surprise his mother by taking some vegetables home. He thought of how proud she would be of him. There was so much to pick from that he did not know where to begin. In the meantime, on the other side of the fence, Lil Pete's siblings had decided it was best to go to the blueberry patch as their mother had asked them to do. Lil Pete stood, looking left or right to see if anyone or anything was around. In the far left corner of the field, he saw a man carrying a large basket. Suddenly, Lil Pete recalled who the man was. It was Mr. McGregor. Lil Pete froze to think where he was. He was in the worst possible place. Lil Pete decided it would be best to go to the blueberry patch with his brother and sisters. But it was too late. Mr. McGregor had seen him. Mr. McGregor dropped his basket and picked up a rake. He began running towards Lil Pete with a raised rake in his hand, yelling, "Thief!" Out of desperation and fear, Lil Pete tried to find the opening where he had entered. Lil Pete was so distracted by seeing Mr. McGregor running towards him that he could not find the opening under the fence. Lil Pete turned suddenly and saw that Mr. McGregor's barn door was open. He hopped as fast as he could to the open door, with Mr. McGregor running right behind him. Lil Pete darted back and forth, trying to find somewhere to hide. He saw a watering can in the corner. Without hesitating, he hopped inside. The watering can was filled with water. Lil Pete waited silently, shivering in the cold water while Mr. McGregor searched every inch of the barn for Lil Pete. From inside the watering can, Lil Pete could hear the heavy, pounding footsteps of Mr. McGregor. Finally, Mr. McGregor gave up and left. Lil Pete heard the bang of the barn door, and the barn became silent. After several minutes had passed, Lil Pete decided it was safe to climb out of the watering can. Once Lil Pete was outside of the barn, he ran toward the fence. He made sure it was away from the view of Mr. McGregor, who was still working in his garden. Squeezing through a small opening, Lil Pete quickly headed for home. Lil Pete hopped towards his house as fast as he could. Lil Pete hopped fast towards home, soaking wet and shivering. Seeing Lil Pete hopping, Mrs. Blue flew in his direction and began chirping loudly.
"Lil Pete! Lil Pete! Where have you been? And are you okay?"
Lil Pete chose not to answer, but quickened his pace to his house. Mrs. Blue flew back to tell Mrs. Rabbit the news. As Lil Pete rounded the bend, he saw his mother hopping quickly towards him. His mother hugged him tightly, not bothering to ask him what had happened. When they got home, Lil Pete began to sniff and sneeze. His eyes began to droop, and his body ached all over.
"You look terrible,"
said his mother.
"Take off those wet clothes and go get in bed. I will bring you some chamomile tea."
Lil Pete hopped slowly to his room and collapsed on top of his bed, not bothering to take off his wet clothes. He soon fell fast asleep.